Egypt, the art of getting from here to there. Moving things around is hard, really hard. Anyone who has ever rowed a boat or paddled a canoe in a place where you had to make a portage can quite enthusiastically tell you how much easier it is to move stuff around on water than on land. But have you ever thought about just how much easier it is? In the early 19th century, Farmer Smith had a small but productive apple orchard in upstate New York. Every fall, he loaded his horse Tobias with 250 pounds of apples from market, which was all that Tobias could carry over the pass that snaked through upstate New York's hilly terrain. Farmer Smith's apples were very popular. He did well, saved his money, and planted more apple trees. In a few years, Farmer Smith had done well enough to afford a cart to transport his harvest, and with Tobias strapped in, he could now take 2,000 pounds of apples to market with each cartload. Years passed, the weather held, and Farmer Smith's apples continued to sell. With his proceeds, he bought more acres of land and planted more apple trees. By the fall of 1825, Farmer Smith was in luck. The long-awaited Erie Canal was finally finished and open for business. Tobias had long since been put out to pasture, so Farmer Smith roped his new horse, Jedediah, to the barge he'd rented in Albany. Jedediah was able to pull 30 tons of apples all the way across the state to Buffalo, where the Erie Canal ended and Lake Erie began. And thanks to the waterways of Lake Erie, Farmer Smith could now sell his apples as far away as Detroit. Almost 2 centuries later, the proportions in the above example have barely budged. In fact, all that's changed is that horsepower has been replaced with horsepower. Modern container ships can transport goods for about net 17 cents per container mile, compared to semi-trailer trucks that do it for net $2.40, including the cost of the locomotion mode, as well as operating costs in both instances. But even this incredible disparity in cost assumes access to an American-style multi-line highway, the sort that simply doesn't exist in some 95% of the planet. It also assumes that the road cargo is all transported by semi rather than less efficient vehicles like those UPS trucks that probably brought you this book. It certainly ignores your family car. It also does not consider the cost and maintenance of the medium of transport itself. The U.S. interstate highway system, for example, responsible for only 1/4 of the United States' road traffic by miles driven, has an annual maintenance cost of $160 billion. By contrast, the Army Corps of Engineers' 2014 budget for all U.S. waterways maintenance is only $2.7 billion, while the oceans are flat out free. Toss in associated costs ranging from the $100 billion Americans spend annually on car insurance to the $130 billion needed to build America's 110,000 service stations to the global supply chain needed to manufacture and service road vehicles. And the practical ratio of road to water transport inflates to anywhere from 40-to-1 in populated flatlands to in excess of 70-to-1 in sparsely populated highlands. Cheap, easy transport does 2 things for you. First, it makes you a lot of money. Cheap transport means you can send your goods farther away in search of more profitable markets. Historically, that's been not only a primary means of capital generation, but also a method of making money wholly independent of government policy or whatever the new economic fad happens to be. It works with oil, grain, people, and widgets. In business terms, it's a reliable perennial. Second, if it is easy to shuttle goods and people around, goods and people will get shuttled around quite a bit. Cheap riverine transport grants loads of personal exposure to the concerns of others in the system, helping to ensure that everyone on the waterway network sees themselves as all in the same boat, often literally. That constant interaction helps a country solidify its identity and political unity in a way that no other geographic feature can. Until modern times, any particular person's world was a pretty small place. This was a simple matter of physics. The wheel eased overland travel, but carting your stuff across endless stretches of land took a lot of energy. So much energy that it was nearly unheard of for people to get their food from more than a few miles away. Anyone who spent his day lugging food wasn't spending his day growing it. Nearly all the work had to be done with muscle power, so the excess food produced per farm was very low. In the era before refrigeration and preservatives, hauling foodstuffs more than a few miles would have been an exercise in futility. Even armies didn't have much in the way of self-managed supply chains right up into the 18th century. Instead, militaries relied on the kindness, or lack of defenses, of strangers for provisions. This kept cities small, very small. In fact, up until the very beginning of the industrial era in the early 1600s, all of the global cities that we think of as epic, New York City, London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, Shanghai, took up less than 8 square miles. That's a square less than 3 miles on a side, about the distance that someone carrying a heavy load can cover in 2 hours. Far smaller than most modern airports. If the cities had been any bigger, people wouldn't have been able to get their food home and still have sufficient time to do anything else. The surrounding farms couldn't have generated enough surplus food to keep the city from starving, even in times of peace. The same goes for civil administration. If the taxman, policeman, and garageman couldn't physically service the territory effectively, then there was no government, no services, and no ability to protect civilians from the dangers of the outside world. Those cultures that tried to grow their cities larger than this natural limit found that famine and cholera returned them to the 8 square mile size with all the speed and delicacy of, well, famine and cholera. This smallness is why it took humanity millennia to evolve into what we now think of as the modern world. Nearly all of the population had to be involved in agriculture simply to feed itself. The minority was non-sedentary peoples. History calls them barbarians, who discovered that one of the few ways to avoid needing to spend your entire day growing food was to spend your entire day stealing other people's. The only way for the farmers to survive was to have some of their own ranks become soldiers and guard against the barbarians, or become engineers to build defensive works. But those who were not farming still had to be fed. Hitting a balance that would grant both security and full bellies was difficult, if not impossible in most locations. Urbanization, which considering the era typically meant a few families building their huts near each other, was rare and temporary, and the global population remained low for eons. Historians often debate what to call this age, with some form of pre-civilized normally winning out. I refer to this age much more directly, when life sucked. Approximately 8,000 years ago, however, things started to change. Around 6000 BC, a few tribes had relocated out of the savanna of contemporary Sudan into the floodplains of the Nile. This was not a decision to be made lightly. At the time, all settlements that engaged in farming did so as a supplement to hunting and gathering, not the other way around. The savanna's wide open ranges were game-rich and offered robust supplies of fruits, nuts, and roots. The lower Nile, in contrast, flowed through the desert. The maximum width of greenlands was no more than the floodplain, at most single digits in miles. And seasonal floods stripped most of the floodplain free of the sorts of mature vegetation that could support animals in numbers, humans included. After the floods, the result was a muddy, denuded moonscape, which quickly cooked into a cracked, baked plain. Turning the Nile into a breadbasket would require centuries of back-breaking labor to store water for the dry season, re-break and retill fields that would wash away in every flood season.